Good morning, everyone. My name is Jonathan Carlos, Fair Housing Manager at CSA. For our first-time listeners, we are a fair housing agency focused on addressing discrimination in housing, including home purchasing, renting, and more. Today, we have another amazing guest speaker for our Fair Housing Facebook Live, Mr. Christopher Brancart, civil rights attorney from Brancart and Brancart. Thank you so much for joining us today as we dissect common fair housing questions most related to familial status. At the end of the session, we will allow some time for any questions that viewers may have, okay?
Great. Well, it's great to be here.
Awesome, awesome. So we can take a few moments for you to introduce yourself, your role with CSA, independently, any other hats that you may wear or that you have worn in the past, some background information on yourself, anything that you would like to share to the viewers.
Sure. Well, whether you see this live or you see it recorded, my name is Chris Brancart, and I live and work in Pescadero, California, just north of Santa Cruz. And I have the good fortune of working with Elizabeth Brancart and Liza Crystal DeMann, who are my partners, and we specialize in representing plaintiffs in fair housing cases, mostly federal Fair Housing Act cases. Been doing that for more than a couple decades now, and have tried to focus on how we can expand the law so that it provides greater rights to the victims of discrimination, and also focusing on techniques that individuals and investigators can use to investigate claims of discrimination. So that's been what we've been doing, and I'm joined here today by Haley Parsley, who is one of our Fair Housing Fellows. Haley, come say hello to the folks in Facebook land. Now we're recorded.
Hi.
Hey,
Everyone.
Haley Parsley. And then CSA, like many fair housing centers and councils around the country, have asked that we work with them to help put together a system by which they can intake and investigate and determine the best referral mechanism for cases that they receive, whether it be pursuant to a HUD grant or CDBG program or an independent program that they set up themselves. So I'm delighted to be here, and I understand that we want to focus on familial status or discrimination against families with children. So great topic, certainly affects all of us, and yeah, look forward to chatting about it.
That is correct. Thank you so much. Thank you for providing your background, your expertise. It's very helpful for everyone that's listening, especially, to learn about what it is that you do and why you do it. So thank you for that. So let's dive right in. So let's hear from you. What is fair housing to you?
Mm-hmm. Look, for better or worse, the biggest determinant of success in the United States is wealth. That is probably the number one indicator of success and status in the United States. So Bill Gates and the likes, they've got us all beat. But the second biggest determinant of a person's success, including the status in which is conferred upon them by others, is where you live. And we've seen more and more of this in the studies that have come out recently about the so-called your zip code determining your educational and your health outcomes. So when we talk about fair housing, we're talking about really two things. We're talking about broadly about providing equal opportunities so that individuals are not held back by circumstances beyond their control. The second legalistic thing that we're talking about when we talk about fair housing is a system of regulations and laws that are designed to eliminate impediments and barriers to access to housing, based upon arbitrary characteristics such as race, color, national origin, and others. So there's a broad, if you will, policy behind fair housing, the notion that we are going to provide access to housing to all individuals so that they can achieve without impediment their life outcomes. But there's a second component part, and that is the system of laws and regulations, which is what we deal with here every day in helping people investigate or in litigating for housing cases.
That is correct. Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for your elaborate, you know, uh, perspective on fair housing. So I did hear you say a little bit about, certain characteristics, which, us in fair housing, we commonly use the term protected classes. So what would be those characteristics or protected classes at the federal level versus the state level?
Right. Well, I think it's important here in California, and that's not the case in many parts of the country, but here in California, it's very important to make a distinction between what's protected on the federal level and also on the state level, because California has been a leader in fair housing throughout the country. I would say it has been, in terms of statutes adopted, whether it's the Rumford Housing Act and then the Jesse Unruh Civil Rights Act, the so-called Unruh Act. We've been a leader all along. In fact, we led so much that we don't speak about this, but that there was a time when Californians actually voted to repeal and make it a constitutional amendment, the so-called Prop 14 in the 1960s, to actually roll back as a constitutional amendment some of the protections that had been enacted by the legislature. Interesting enough, that passed about the time Ronald Reagan was elected our governor back in the 1960s, and it was struck down by the Supreme Court, upholding the California Supreme Court that struck down the so-called Prop 14, rolling back the Unruh Act, rolling back the Rumford Act, because it denied individuals equal opportunity. Fascinating little bit of history. We think of ourselves as being quite forward-thinking and liberal in California, and in fact we are, and yet there's also a very profound cross current that has been pulling us back. And I think the Prop 14 history in 1960s sort of reflects that. But going to your question, look, when we first passed the Fair Housing Act in 1968, we do something that's kind of unique, and in some ways not. The notion of having fair housing or eliminating housing discrimination in the United States was actually first brought up in the World War II period during the New Deal, in which we were trying to provide as much housing as possible to people who were working in the defense industries. It lagged, but then it came back, believe it or not. The very first Fair Housing Act was the 1958 Civil Rights Act. People don't talk about it because they didn't do that much. Basically, just authorized the Department of Justice to file cases to stop overt housing discrimination. What's famous about that law is that it was the statute that inspired the longest filibuster ever in the history of the Senate in order to stop fair housing. And it was meager. It was basically no discrimination on the basis of race. The Department of Justice can prosecute these cases. 1958, no one heard of it. Why? Because it didn't do much. But that was enough to inspire Strom Thurmond, Dixiecrat senator from South Carolina, to actually engage in the longest filibuster. Back in the old days when they used to have to keep talking, nowadays they just kill it in the leadership office. Yeah, that was the longest one. So he stood and he talked, I think 60, 70, 80 hours, but eventually it passed. Probably means nothing to us, other than it does show that the commitment to fair housing on the federal level has been around a while. They tried, believe it or not, to put fair housing into the 1964 Civil Rights Act. That's the one we think of as Title VII, that stops discrimination in public accommodations and employment. But the notion of adding housing to the 64 Civil Rights Act was seen as a bridge too far. In other words, people were saying the country's ready to work with diverse groups of people, but we ain't going to live next door to them. And so they dropped that. Title 8, it's called title, as if it's a part of a bill. They dropped that out and they brought it back in 1966. And in 1966, it was really an amazing event. When the 1966 Civil Rights Act, which was basically the Fair Housing Act, went before Congress, it was the first time in our history that the Republican leadership did not support civil rights. Now, I know that seems strange for many of you who are on the younger, but believe it or not, the Republican Party was the stalwart of civil rights, and it was the Democrats that often it took time to bring around to the civil rights agenda. And in 1966, Gerald Ford, who was the minority leader of the Republicans in the House of Representatives, came out and said, we're going to oppose as a party the 66 Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act. And in fact, it did fail after hearings. And it wasn't until 1968, in the wake of the riots following the assassination of Martin Luther King, that Congress was mobilized to go ahead and say, my gosh, we've got to do something. Where's that fair housing law? Let's pass that to show the country that we're engaged and willing to address the issues of racial inequality. And that's where the law lay. When we first passed the Civil Rights Act, and you're talking about the federal level, it was race, color, national origin, and religion, right? And we don't add sex on the federal level until 72. And then we don't add the additional federal categories, familial status, which means families with children, and disability until 1988. And there, I think, is something important to identify, which is, although we'll talk in a minute about the California law, what's interesting is that we think of the dramatic increase in civil rights protection for people with disabilities, the reasonable accommodation and modification of being a creature of the ADA. But in fact, the Fair Housing Act was the law that actually put those theories into practice 2-3 years before the ADA. And here's the last, I think, paradox in our history, is that who was the president who signed the 1988 Fair Housing Amendments Act into law? Well, it was Ronald Reagan. It was the man who rode the coattails on the Prop 14 decades before that was to roll back the protections that California had put in place. So we have President Ronald Reagan to thank for that. It was an extraordinary turn. I will say this, and I think history misses this point. The person who really deserves a lot of credit on the civil rights front for fair housing at that time, believe it or not, is George W. Bush. He pressed for the ADA, he pressed for the Fair Housing Act. Anyways, enough about that. When you talk about our state law, much broader. So we protect so many more categories. And when we say protect categories, we mean we are barred from making housing decisions that have the purpose or effect of disadvantaging, of if you will, adversely affecting individuals because of familial status, race, color. That's the federal. On the state level, much, much broader, touching on source of income, marital status, sexual orientation, age, all of those categories. And I would say this, the categories protected under the California state law are so broad that if you can find an arbitrary personal characteristic, as opposed to fitting into these little pukas, an arbitrary personal characteristic, and that is the basis for an adverse housing decision, that's probably discrimination, certainly under the Unruh Act, and it is discrimination under our state fair housing law, FEHA, the Fair Employment and Housing Act.
So those arbitrary characteristics would be in terms of fitting into a category that's not necessarily stated.
Absolutely, and this is how and here's how it works. It is a construction of the Unruh Act that protects or bars discrimination by business establishments, including landlords, banks, realtors, based upon arbitrary characteristics. Now, but the protections of the Unruh Act are incorporated by reference into our state fair housing law, FEHA, the Fair Employment and Housing Act. And there's a provision of FEHA that says, if you're going to violate Unruh Act, bringing in that arbitrary characteristics language, if that's a violation, it's actionable under FEHA. So we have a very, very broad, if you will, canvas that protects individuals on all types of arbitrary bases. But the obvious ones that are missing in the federal level: source of income, sexual orientation, age and marital status. Those are the big ones that we see a lot of activity on, unique to California.
Right, and from our understanding, California has, if not the most protected classes, one of the most, right? Which is also really important, and we hope that states follow suit as as well at the federal level, as you mentioned. So given the history of the protected classes at the federal level, and in the state level, we did hear some information about familial status, that it came in somewhat later than the first few. So how would you describe familial status, and what's the basis of this protected class related to fair housing specifically?
Sure. So before the federal law, but in 1988, as part of the Federal Fair Housing Amendments Act, two new protected classes are added: handicap, disability, they use the word handicap, and also familial status. Now, familial status was very broadly defined to mean, if you will, to quote the TV show, what is it, Married with Children? Well, it's Married with Children, but it's much broader than that. It's essentially any household that has minor household members, minor children, who are in the care, custody, guardianship, or parents of an adult. So, and that has been broadly construed to also include and cover, for example, individuals who are pregnant. So it's a very, very broad law. It's not age discrimination. It's about protecting this relationship of parent, child, guardian, child, pregnant woman, and unborn baby, that kind of thing. And what's unique about it, I think, is this. What's unique about it is that prior to adding familial status, if you think about the protected categories, they were somewhat immutable. In other words, I am born white, or I am born African American. I am, if you will, if we racially categorize people, or if we determine that they are biological as opposed to a social construct. But when it comes to familial status, we're all covered at some point, right? I mean, think about it. I'm born as a baby and I'm living with some adults. I'm not like a baby in a house by myself, and I'm covered, even though I historically might think of myself not being protected by the fair housing laws. And then I grow up and I become 18 and I don't know, I do whatever I do. I decide I'm not going to like fair housing, but I was protected by fair housing. And interestingly enough, if you think about the arc of life, if we all go through that arc of life and we're not hit by a bus by the end of our lives, guess what? We're probably all disabled. So the Fair Housing Act did something very unique. It sort of, in some ways, by adding familial status at the beginning, disability at the end, it sort of covered everyone who historically hadn't been thought, well, I'm not a person of color, I'm not a woman, things like that, but it actually protects everyone at different stages of their lives, and certainly depending upon household composition, things like that. So it's interesting. It certainly, on the federal level, was a dramatic change, because prior to the 88 amendments, it was completely normal to discriminate against families with children. Very common. And I think that's what inspired Congress to pass the law and make it a national law, was that increasingly families with children were being shut out of, had less availability to access housing, which meant, if you just do Economics 101, families with children ended up paying more for crappier housing simply because there were too many people competing for a smaller share of the market. And Congress wanted to address that. And that was essentially the thinking behind adding familial status to the protection under the Fair Housing Law.
Are there any common examples or common cases personally that you have come across regarding familial status discrimination?
Sure. And I think here's what's interesting about it is there's common examples that fit within our classic notion of discrimination, of intentional discrimination. I don't want any children, or I don't want any children upstairs, or I don't want any children in this part of a complex, or I don't want to, et cetera, et cetera. And there's also a unique part of the fair housing enforcement regime called disparate impact, in which we have facially neutral rules, but they have a disparate impact upon families with children. And those too may be violations of the Fair Housing Act. So it's not just intentional discrimination, it can also be facially neutral rules that exclude or have a limiting effect on families with children. And what are they? Occupancy restrictions, use of the common areas in terms of restrictions on, you can't play, no children outside, as well as simply overt discrimination. I don't want kids here. And in fact, there's an example I want to share with you. Haley, you've worked on a case.
Yes.
Yeah, Haley Parsley. Haley Parsley.
Yes.
Haley's worked on a case recently that deals with familial status discrimination. I believe that's in the North Dakota. Is that right?
It's in North Dakota.
Yeah.
Yes.
And what happened? What happened in that case?
In that case, the case is about a family that experienced discrimination, familial status discrimination. A single mother lived in an apartment complex in a unit with her 4 kids. And then she had a baby in 2021. During the pandemic, she had a baby. And so there were 6 people living in her complex. Her complex was 3 bedrooms. The owners of the apartment, which is managed by a company called AHDI, had an occupancy limit. They said it's 1.5 people per room. And so they didn't renew her lease. They effectively evicted her because she had 2 people per room instead of 1.5. That's
1.5 people per room.
People per room.
Oh,
0.5
wow.
person.
I don't know how we do that.
0.5 of a person. This is the middle of the pandemic, and she was evicted, and obviously that rule has a disparate impact on families because if you have a larger family, you're not going to be able to rent these units.
How's a disparate impact? Families are numbers of people.
Yes.
And if you're going to limit the numbers per se, you're going to limit people. So that case is, I think, a great example. I think that's a great example of familial status discrimination, where you can see a landlord did not think he or she was overtly discriminating against families with children. It was a facially neutral rule, but it had a clear disparate impact. And in this case, profoundly so. I mean, fewer than 2 people per bedroom. Well, thank you. Keep us posted.
Okay.
There it is. Haley Parsley.
Thank you, Haley. Appreciate that. And so we heard a little bit about the fact that this person was essentially discriminated while she was living there, right? And in other cases, there are the fact that some are discriminated against prior to moving in, right? Because they are refused this rental. For example, in this case, it would be, families. So that kind of brings me to the idea of residence discrimination versus, like a rental applicant discrimination. So can you kind of, give us a short, description, explanation of the difference between those two?
Sure. And I think it's important to recognize, especially in the familial status area, because most of the cases that fair housing centers encounter are what we call resident discrimination or in-place tenant discrimination, as opposed to home seekers. And when you think about discrimination, it can happen in 2 ways. Well, think about it this way. Think about a job. Oftentimes, discrimination happens in two ways in a job. One, you don't get the job. You're refused the job because of race, color, national, whatever. The second way discrimination occurs, and actually most commonly, is where it is not so overt and the impact is not so dramatic. It is you're given the job, but you feel you're being treated unfairly because the way you're treated within the job because of your race, color, and national origin. In other words, I'm a guy, Haley is a woman, we're the same job and everything like that, but she gets 2 weeks of vacation, I only get one. Like, what's that about? Right? We should have the same. And I think that notion of disparate treatment of families with children or children by landlords is where you see the so-called resident discrimination. You see the biggest impact on families with children, and that varies widely. It can be in situations such as occupancy restrictions. It can be how one imposes the rules and applies them, whether it be in terms of noise or using the facilities. It can be if you're talking about discrimination, the so-called home seeker or applicant discrimination. It can be rules that limit what housing will be made available to families with children. For example, many people who live in landlords or managers that run multifamily dwellings would like to keep tots off the second floor. The sense is that it's dangerous, and also that kids running around, I can attest to this, having raised 3 of them, are noisy. They jump up and down and things like this. And so it was very common, and still relatively common, not as frequent, but it is still relatively common. Landlords will steer families with children away from second floor units and to first floor units, or they'll say, we have nothing available, in fact, because we don't want to rent you on the second floor. Now, obviously, they feel they're doing it for the best of reasons, that it's safety because of the second floor or noise that may disturb others. But the fact is, safety determinations are left to the parent or the guardian. And the fact is that we have reasonable rule restrictions that apply to everyone, but we cannot assume that families with children are necessarily going to generate noise that would be disruptive. We can't justify assigning or steering families to certain units simply because we believe it's in their best interest. You see most discrimination in familial status, the so-called resident or in-place discrimination, but we still see quite a bit of the so-called home seeker discrimination, denying housing to families with children at the outset.
That discussion kind of brought to the attention the fact that if they are steering these families because, for example, a toddler is better off on the first floor for safety reasons or any reasons, what if they are no longer any units available at the bottom floor? Does that mean that there are no units available for that family? And when in fact on the second floor, third floor, etc., there very, very well may be many units available for them. So I just kind of wanted to point that out. It's a real problem, and it can happen in a lot of different ways. There's discrimination happens in very, very many different ways. So do you have any recommended best practices for housing providers when addressing these families? So that kind of includes both best practices to act on and best practices to avoid.
Well, I will say a couple things come in mind. The first thing is, I think it's very important that if you are going to be operating a apartment complex, which is a very large, valuable asset, that you make sure that you have people in place that know what the bright line rules of the road are. You can get those in a variety of different ways. Your local fair housing center will have access to HUD materials. HUD does put out a series of materials. There are regulations that are clearly stated, but I will say there's another source, and that is the California Apartment Association. While I found myself oftentimes on the other side of them on policy issues. The fact is that many of the materials that California Apartment Association puts out are very well written, and they've thought about these issues quite a bit. And so if you don't feel comfortable going to a fair housing center, such as CSA, there are many of them in Los Angeles. The Legal Aid Society does work in it. In San Diego, the Legal Aid Society does work in it. CSA, your organization, does work on it, but throughout California, DFEH has some wonderful materials on the DFEH website. But look, if you don't feel comfortable using those, become a member of California Apartment Association. I can't believe I'm hawking for California Apartment Association, but look, they've done a very good job, and I think we all need to acknowledge that. So first thing is, let's get the right materials. Two other things come to mind. One thing is, read your materials and ask yourself, are there any overt statements that would discourage or limit the activities of families with children? In fact, in California, there's really only one overt rule that you should be thinking about. And I think that may even be subject to some change, and that is whether children should be left unattended around a swimming pool. Of course, water is dangerous, and that is in the California Regulatory Code. But outside of that, narrow rule in the California Regulatory Code regarding swimming pools and unattended minors. Outside of that, there should be no rules that overtly discriminate against children in your materials. That's the first thing. Second thing is, you need to make sure that everyone is treated fairly in terms of what information they're provided, in terms of what's available, regardless of whether they have children, big or small. And the last thing is, while we all want, of course, because we, as human beings, we want to protect little children, things like that. The fact is that safety standards, when it comes to, oh, this apartment is on a second floor, it might be dangerous, these steps are dangerous. Safety standards are to be left to the parents, not the landlord. We're not to impose our sense of what would be appropriate housing on parents and on families, because it's that kind of thinking that has led us to situations where many housing units that would otherwise be available for families with children aren't. We take them off the table, the people who make housing decisions. And that means what? Families with children today, still, as in the past, are basically paying more on average for crappier housing. So that's two things I'd say. The last thing is this. If you receive a complaint from a family with children, it is important that you have some complaint process in mind. And if you have a question, so that they can go from the manager to someone higher up in the organization to resolve it. But if you have a question, to contact organizations like CSA, HUD, DFEH, and ask them. They have a wealth of information, will help you unravel it, because many of these situations can be resolved before they go to an administrative complaint, and certainly before they go to a court case.
Thank you for for those very resourceful advice for housing providers. It's some things that we may not think about to consider. So it's important to to address those. So given that we spoke a little bit about the best practices for housing service providers, or what they should do to avoid potential discrimination. What is a best practice for a tenant or potential tenant to do if they feel that they are being discriminated against?
I'll tell you, the very best practice is to make a complaint. To make a complaint to your Fair Housing Center in San Diego, as I mentioned, there's CSA, there's Legal Aid Society, wonderful both organizations that you can make a complaint to. But throughout California, there are a number of private nonprofits that actually take in complaints, provide options, and investigate them. The first most important thing is make a complaint. If you're not comfortable going to a nonprofit, all you need to do is go online, and DFEH, the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, has complaint forms, as well as HUD. Very simple to fill in. Why do I say that? I say that because it is amazing how underreported discrimination is, particularly discrimination on the basis of familial status and other forms of discrimination. Individuals will not exercise their rights, and that has two adverse effects. One, certainly everyone should be entitled to protection of law. But second, if we don't make a complaint and enforce the law, then it's as if the law doesn't exist. And if it's not pursued, then the person that comes behind you isn't going to have the benefit of you standing up to exercise your rights. That's the first thing. Second thing is this: when you go and make a complaint, there are professionals that are at the state agencies, the federal agencies, and the nonprofits, such as CSA and others, that will go ahead and advise you, here are your rights, here's the process you go through, and give you some options. And the last thing is, oftentimes you may be making a complaint, you think it's wrong, but an investigation will show, well, it really wasn't discrimination. And then you can resolve that and move forward. But we're never going to be able to get to that point, well, maybe this really isn't discrimination, until we make a complaint. And housing discrimination is grossly underreported. People need to complain. Complain to your local agencies or your state or federal agency.
It definitely is, in my experience. Many have fear to report these acts, or they just don't know. They don't know that these laws exist. It could be many different things or reasons why they will not report. However, as you mentioned, it is very important that's the first step to do, is report it. If no one is there to enforce the law, does it even exist? So thank you. I'm very glad that you reiterated that point. Before I let you off the hook, however, I want to make sure if we have any questions from our viewers. And as of right now, I do not see any. So
well, that's okay, because will be recorded. People can watch it later, and as often is the case, after you see something online, you might have a question that comes to your mind, and that's why organizations such as yours are there to answer those questions. And I hope people follow up, and I hope this gives people information so they'll start thinking about where to go to get answers to questions in the future.
Definitely. Well, thank you. Thank you to your team for making this live session possible. You did a wonderful job in answering all the questions above and beyond. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you.
I appreciate it.
All right. Well, bye-bye, Facebook land.
Bye. Take care.